what are my damages after an accident? Okay, this is interesting because it's hard to define it in terms of dollars, but it's easy to talk about it in terms of what types of damages are someone entitled to. Because we've mentioned every case can be different. One case, someone may be in pain for several years and only have $5,000 worth of medical treatment. Some cases, someone could have a $25,000 ER bill, but then never go back to the doctor and they were totally fine the next day.
Sure.
So, and then everything in between. So saying two cases are alike or being able to tell from day one what somebody is owed is nearly impossible. So I like to talk about it in terms of just the scope of damages and give people an idea of the types of things that they're entitled to. And those are really divided into, economic and non-economic harm. Mm-hmm. The easy ones, of course, are the cost of medical treatment, your lost wages. The economic harm is basically your out-of-pocket costs, everything down to the mileage back and forth to the doctor's office. And we try to be as precise as we can with those because they're the most objective. Not that they're 100% objective, but they're the most objective. But where you really get into it being more of an art than a science, really, is where you start talking about things like pain and suffering, mental anguish, loss of enjoyment of life. Those can mean different things to different people. Mm-hmm. How do you explain that to your clients, and how do you present that to adjusters?
So it is a case-by-case basis, and you have to take into account the treatment itself. You can't argue $100,000 of pain and suffering for 2 weeks at the chiro.
I suppose you can, but not with much credibility.
Yeah, not very much credibility, and that's not what we're in the business of doing.
And let's say a little bit, it kind of comes down to what a jury would think is fair. And that's really what it comes down to.
That's the actual answer to the question.
You're right.
Is what would a jury of your peers think is fair to compensate you for the pain that you experienced physically and the suffering or the loss of enjoyment of life of going through the process, and then any other, other issues that you may have that are in that kind of spectral gray area and very subjective. But it's really a tough answer. Every case is so different. But basically the length of time, the treatment, the injuries to the person, the effect on their life outside of going to the doctor. Were you bound to a wheelchair, or were you in crutches for 3 months? Could you do everything that you normally like to do, your hobbies, playing with your kids? All of that kind of stuff goes into what the pain and suffering is.
This is where it really gets to be important to get to know your client, and why it's important for there to be a relationship between the attorney and the client, or for there to be some real conversation, or sit down with them at some point to discuss these things, because it is different for everybody. And for some people, a minor injury can have a drastic effect on their life, or what otherwise might be called a minor injury, if you just look at the medical records, could prevent them from being able to do their job, from picking up their children, having to hire daycare, to not be able to clean their house and have to hire cleaning services, not be able to drive their vehicle and have to Uber everywhere.
Yep.
And to some degree, those almost become more objective. They're couched in terms of loss of enjoyment of life, but you can place a market value on it because you know what a cleaning service is worth. Mm-hmm. You know what a driving service is worth. So there are ways that you can place a market value on loss of enjoyment of life or pain and suffering. And so I think a useful tool is to try to distill those subjective things into objective economic terms as much as possible. But again, the only way to do that is to really talk to your client and figure out what it means.
Like you said, to discuss it and to constantly follow up with your client, see how they're doing. And it's things that insurance companies, you're right, having some sort of dollar amount or objective amount to something helps the insurance company adjusters so much better. They really do not like the term pain and suffering, and they assign arbitrary dollar figures to every injury.
They do.
And so, just trying to maximize that really is where we come into play. I mean, doing everything we can and investigating and seeking out any little thing that we can.
Like medical records, for instance, which oftentimes now have pain scales. Mm-hmm. And pain scales can be very helpful in determining the extent of pain as well as the duration of pain, because on visit 1, they may say this person was experiencing a 7. After 2 months of treatment, that may be down to a 5 or a 6 or whatever the case may be. But you can trace the graph of pain according to those pain scales, which actually becomes pretty helpful.
It does.
From showing, okay, well, month 1, they had X amount of pain. Month 2, they had this amount of pain. And if you can agree on what a severe amount of pain is, then you can kind of back into, okay, well, half of that would be worth this.
Yeah.
So there are useful ways to present it and some tools. But
you sit there and you say, okay, if you're in a constant state of 6 out of 10 pain, what would compensate you for living through that?
Yeah.
That's a way to think about it. And we everyone has their different taxes and everything. I really don't like actually assigning a dollar amount to the day, for example, like each day of treatment. But it's such a tough way to discuss it, and it's such a nebulous thing to kind of pick out of thin air. But that's what we have to try to do.
Yeah. And again, plaintiffs have the burden of proof.
Yep.
So it's on us to help prove how a wreck or how an injury affected somebody and to prove the extent of their pain. And the more information we can gather, the better we will be at proving it. Mm-hmm. So it really comes down to studying the medical records, knowing your client, finding out how it affected them, finding out how it affected their performance at their job, and finding ways to create an economic tie to things that a lot of people might consider to be subjective.
Mm-hmm. And we have to compile and provide all that.
Yeah.
Because, when we're dealing with a pre-litigation settlement negotiations type case, mm-hmm.
The
only evidence is what we present to the insurance company.
And, one thing I like to do is make sure that people, after a wreck, and I think this is a great tip for anyone that has suffered an injury and is going through medical treatment, is to journal that journey for them. Describe the amount of pain that they're in, describe the things that they were unable to do that day due to their pain, to document the days where they may have suffered a migraine headache, for instance, or that their knee hurt so bad that they just couldn't get out of their chair, or their knee swelled so badly that they weren't able to do their job. And where that becomes really useful isn't necessarily in the context of a settlement negotiation, but if that case for some reason does go into litigation, it can be a year or more later when that person's deposition is taken, and at that point, we're asking them to recount those days.
And you have contemporaneous notes.
If you have contemporaneous notes, it's much easier for someone to either have those notes to help read or discuss it in a deposition, but if nothing else, to help jog their memory about what life was like during that time.
Well, it's the same we talk about when you get in an accident, to try to recall and record as much information as you can about what happened. Mm-hmm. And it's the same reason. And so that is a very useful tool. And I've actually had reviews over medical records with clients before we, are sending off a demand package to an insurance company, where we do that. We go through, even if it's not contemporaneous to the day you went to the hospital and the day you went to the doctor, to kind of go through week by week. And, how did you feel? What was your home treatment after you went to physical therapy? And, how was that? Was it easy? Was it, things like that. So it's a good question.
Yeah.